What is up, my Lorcana Goons, and welcome back to the Lorcana Goons channel. In this meta report, we're going to go over some winning decks from this recent weekend, starting off with the first place Ruby Amethyst list from Domingo Martinez, where he finished first place at the Disney Lorcana European Championship. Shout out our very first continental champion, Domingo Martinez. Ruby Amethyst taking first place. I said it, Ruby Amethyst best deck. I am a true believer. But before we get into these decks, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you're a Lorcana Goon, because it does support the channel. Thank you very much for joining us on this meta report as we go through multiple tournaments, but we got to break down the winning list. Ruby Amethyst, one of the best decks of the format, especially now that you can play some of the hard-hitting cards like 4 copies of Genie Wish Fulfilled. Now, the ultimate curve used to be turn 1 Turnabog, turn 2 Flynn Rider, turn 3 Sisu into turn 4 Castle, but this list is playing 0 locations. We've seen this before, and we've had this conversation before on the channel about how some Ruby Amethyst players believe you don't need locations right now, and instead of playing a Castle on turn 4, you're playing Genie on turn 4. And what's cool now is that you can even play Rabbit on turn 4 and not really worry about losing out that draw power because you have the 4 copies of Genie in your deck as well. This deck is playing 15 uninkable cards, the 1 Sisu empowered sibling alongside 2 Medusa, 2 Tremaine, 3 Be Prepared Not 4. And like I said, man, that Genie is so powerful because he quests for 2, he's evasive, he has a very heavy willpower, so you need to use cards like Along Came Zeus if you're playing Steel, or you need to have cards like Brawl or, you know, Elsa Genie combo to get rid of the opposing Genie. And if you could play Genies back to back to back, you're just questing for 2 with every character, adding so much pressure. But we do got to talk about this one card that nobody's been playing in Ruby Amethyst, but I bet we're going to start seeing this Bell, Accomplished Mystic, in a lot of future Ruby Amethyst decks now. 5 cost inkable, 4 willpower, 4 strength, quest for 2, and has an ability that says when you play this character, move up to 3 damage from chosen character to chosen opposing character. So oftentimes your Genie's floating around or your Elsa's floating around with lingering damage because Elsa has rush, and later on in the game you can play this belt to move damage from your Elsa to an opposing character. This plays around resist, which is really good. What's cool also is that you don't have to pick your own character. You can pick another opposing character and move damage to another opposing character. So the only stipulation is that the second character needs to be the opposing character, but the first character you pick, the damage in which you're moving, can also be an opposing character. So it's a pretty strong card. I feel like a lot of purple players in general, like whether you're playing blue, purple, or Amethyst Steel, where they were experimenting with this Bell, Accomplished Mystic, and I love to see it in Ruby Amethyst. I think it fits very well in this deck. But yeah, no locations, kind of crazy to me, but congratulations, Domingo Martinez getting first place at the first Disney Lorcana Continental Championship. And in second place, we have a green-purple deck by Michel Aricelli. Shout out you for getting second place with this Amethyst Emerald deck piloted, playing a gang of 1-drops for Turnabog, Merfolk, Diablo, and Magic Broom to make sure you can quest early on. This is the reason why Merfolks are like $3 today, by the way. That Merfolk causes really early aggression as a 2-quester character alongside Bonsai. You can play on turn 2 with that 1 copy of Bonsai. It helps you quest a lot quicker. 4 copies of Go-Go Tamago, because this card can let you burst lore. And if you're playing against the green-purple, you need to play around Go-Go Tamago. The same way you make like trades when you're playing around Rapunzel or Super Goof, you need to respect the card like Go-Go Tamago in the opposing player's deck, because you don't want to be challenging with your characters and leaving damage on them willy-nilly, because then you're leaving yourself open to a Go-Go Tamago effect. And she has an ability that says when you play this character, you can pay 2 more ink to gain lore equal to damage on a chosen opposing character. So if there's a Tamato on the opposing side of the board and I drop an Elsa and then I swing into it with a Fox and maybe a Crab, and that Tamato has 7 damage on it, I can play Go-Go Tamago and I gain 7 lore. And I guarantee you that's happened already in the history of Lorcana. So this is a card you for sure want to respect and play around. We have Peter Pan's Shadow Finder in this deck as well, which is a great out to cards like Diablo or an opposing Go-Go Tamago. Also very good way to combat an opposing Genie, because you can use that and Elsa to challenge the same Genie. But green-purple being a very strong deck that lets you quest in the early game, you can gain control of the board by playing Cloud Kicker to bounce the opposing characters, and then after that you can just float and sit on your Genies, your White Flowers, your Goats, and your Rabbits, because all of these cards have abilities that happen on play, and 2 of them even have abilities when they leave play. So yeah, green-purple being one of the best decks. Shout out Michel Asarieli for getting second place. In top 8, we have Caillou going to Worlds. By the way, all these top 8 competitors are going to Worlds. Congrats for getting the World. This is a red-blue deck looking very standard as we've been seeing it in this recent meta. Maui have sharks, we have dragons, Tamatoas, lucky dimes, and everything you want in a red-blue deck. But I mean, this deck's still doing what it does best. You got control in the early game with the Sisus, the ice blocks, and then in the mid game, you even have Mauis. Later on in the game, you can play the Maui sharks and start generating value every time you play removal cards like Brawl, Be Prepared. This deck is really good. Only one copy of Lucky Dime is the standard now from what I'm seeing for red-blue players, because that Maui half shark really gives you the ability to just generate lore passively, right? But I do want to stress that maybe you also don't want to rely too heavily on that Maui half shark because it does lose to Be Prepared. So if you have a game with Lucky Dime, play into the Lucky Dime because you cannot Be Prepared a Lucky Dime, right? But red blue still being an amazing deck this format. So good that there's multiple ways you can play this deck. Actually, this was the deck that was in first place of Swiss that day for that tournament on the first day, day one. Piloted by Kiyoshi123. Shout out you for getting first place in Swiss at the Continental European Tournament with red blue burn location. I don't know, but it's playing Flynn Rider, 3 copies of the Flynn Rider Frenemy, 3 copies of Sisu Emboldened Warrior, and 4 copies of McDuck Manor. Wow, that sounds like a crazy curve to ramp through, especially if you can follow that up with maybe some, I say, the Azurite Seas or How Far I'll Go or something, maybe even a Shift Sisu a turn or two later. But yeah, this deck looking really interesting. Not much ramp outside of 3 Tipo, Sail, and How Far I'll Go at 3. So you're not maximizing on your ramp, but I feel like that's okay because you want to prioritize more cards that have more removal, like Maleficent Monstrous Dragon, Medusa, 3 copies of Be Prepared, which are very important, I think, if you're playing a kind of burn style deck, because there's 3 copies of A Pirate's Life, which is a psalm that's going to let you gain 2 lore and your opponent loses 2 lore. So normally we see like 1 copy of this card in the Ruby Sapphire to kind of like balance the game state so you don't lose to hyper aggro too easily, but 3 copies is what we've seen by Kiyoshi, and with 3 copies of that Maui shark, like I said, to add more burn damage as you go. Very awesome to see. Next up, we're going over one of the 2 top 8 purple steel decks that was in this tournament. So in top 8, we have a purple steel by Swan Day. I do want to highlight this Hades Lord of the Dead. Very interesting to add the word dead in there. I thought, you know, it's Lorcana, they would have said Lord of the Discard Pile or something, but this Hades is an amethyst card, 6 cost, uninkable, 3 strength, 4 willpower. He quests for 3, which is a big quester. And then during the opponent's turn, whenever one of your characters is banished, you gain 2 lore. And as we know with the purple engine, gaining 2 lore passively is very strong, especially if you're gaining lore in the early game with cards like Calhoun the Goon, which is going to be a 3 strength character, 2 willpower, but resist +1. Lets you challenge opposing characters and gain 2 lore when you banish them. So that's very nice, especially if you're playing in a meta with a bunch of early game characters like the copies of Followers, Diablo, Magic Broom. I like Smee and Pluto in this deck a lot because you have a lot of early game questers with that Smee and the Genie and whatnot, and later on in the game you can protect them with Baloo, or you can keep dropping 2 lore questers with that Lawrence, right? And look, we're seeing Bell, Accomplished Mystic, also being played in Amethyst Steel, so it's not just Ruby Amethyst, it's not just Blurple, it's a Amethyst Steel as well. And you know, there's also some pretty cool interactions with this deck because you have a lot more characters that you can challenge with, even damage dealers like Smash and Fire the Cannons. And we're also seeing 3 copies of the Library, which in my opinion is the better Amethyst location you might want to consider playing right now. This is the second purple steel that was in top 8 of the Euro Continentals, piloted by Andy, who also won his LCQ bubble. So congrats to you. If you don't know, you can enter the last chance qualifier, and if you win that 5 rounds, you have to go undefeated. Then you also get to play the main event. And so he went undefeated on Friday, and then in the main event on Saturday, he finished with a good enough record to make day 2. And in day 2, he won his first round, made it to top 8, got the world's invite with Amethyst Steel, playing the Tinkerbell package. We're seeing the Surfer Tink here. This is a Tinkerbell 3 cost thinkable, 1 strength, 3 willpower that can quest for 2, and she's evasive. Very nice when you have other evasive characters to complement this card, like the 4 copies of Genie, which we're seeing in every purple deck. Every purple deck is playing 4 copies of Genie because it's a draw engine, right? No rabbits in this deck because, you know, we're just playing the Genies instead. Rabbits uninkable, so we got to make sure we keep a nice uninkable count in this deck because we are playing 2 Calhoun and 3 copies of Doc Bold Knight. Good to see Doc being played in some of these top 8 decks because I think Doc is a very strong card. Lets you discard your hand and draw 2 cards, and it's a May effect. You don't have to do it, so you can do it. Well, if you have 2 Docs in hand, you play the first Doc, you don't do the effect. Play the second Doc, you can do the effect, right? The best part is when you start drawing into more Docs after that, or Genies and stuff like that, so you can keep drawing cards. Love to see it. Gantu as well is another power card that we're seeing in the top 8 of the Euro Continentals. Gantu is a 4 quester. He's a 5 cost inkable character, 4 strength, 3 willpower. But hey, when you're questing for 4, that sounds like a good enough excuse to play a 5-cost inkable vanilla character, right? It's also good to see that we're still seeing vanilla characters be played in Lorcana. Characters that don't have abilities. This Gantu has no ability. He's just a big body that can quest for a lot. I want to highlight this green-purple deck that was in top 16, piloted by Lorcana Decklists. Shout out you, Lorcana Decklists. Awesome guy. I love the content that you make with artifacts, and I've been a huge follower and fan on Twitter for the longest time. So if you're watching this, huge congrats for getting top 16, brother. This deck is playing Dawn Carnage and a 5-cost inkable evasive character, 4 strength, 4 willpower, quest for 2, has evasive. Like I said, this is very good. I think evasive characters are just good. Evasive characters are just good in this meta right now, especially because we're in this whole like genie situation where like everybody's playing genie, right? So I feel like Lorcana Decklist kind of metagame this tournament by playing Pegasus and Crab, because if you play Pegasus on turn 1, blah blah blah, turn 3, turn 4, they play a genie, you can play Crab, bump up your Pegasus and smack into the genie and clear that. What's cool about Dawn Carnage too is that if you're going first, on turn 4 you play genie, on turn 4 they play genie, and then on your turn 5 you play Dawn Carnage. Whether or not you want to have Elsa in that situation, so you can use Elsa and genie to clear their genie, but if you don't have it, Dawn Carnage is also a nice answer because he immediately will contest the opposing genie. And if your opponent decides to Elsa you, this is going to let you clear a genie or the opposing Elsa after it challenges, right? So in the mirror match, I think it's pretty nice of a card. We're also seeing 2 copies of Mother Knows Best, which is a card that I don't see a lot of Emerald players use anymore. It's a card from the first chapter, 3 cost, unequable song, return chosen character to the player's hand. That's all it does. Pretty nice card, and a free bounce card, a free removal, if you will, especially when you're playing these evasive characters or even cards that burst lore like Go-Go Tamago, White Rose, and 4 copies of Merlin Rabbit. Hey, 4 Rabbit and 4 Genie in this deck. Love to see it. I'm telling you, Rabbit's the best card in the game, but Genie might be a close second. You know, Genie might be a close second to the best card in all of Lorcana. Green Purple is already kind of an aggro deck, right? And I feel like shout out Artifacts for making this this like the list that you're playing right now. So I feel like adding extra cards that will let you keep your characters alive, like Mother Knows Best, is definitely a good strategy. Or even adding extra evasive questers like Dawn Carnage. And what's cool about Dawn Carnage is that he has 4 strength, right? So that means he's not in range for cards like Madame Medusa, which is very important. Also has 4 willpower, which means he's not in range for like cards like the Storm Rage on Smash. If your opponent wants to Strength of a Raging Fire this card, they're gonna have to have a lot of characters on board. And that's not necessarily going to happen, I think, when you're playing 4 Elsa, 4 Kit Cloud Kicker, and all these other cards. In top 16, we had a Sapphire Steel list piloted by Justin Morales. Shout out you for getting top 16 with Sapphire Steel. The only Sapphire Steel in Top Cut as far as I know so far. Not all the lists were revealed, by the way, for the top cut at the for the European Championship. So we're just going off of what's available on inkdex.com. So huge shout out to inkdex.com for collecting these lists. But yeah, Sapphire Steel, we've seen lists like this before. It is playing Whole New World. We have 3 copies of the Jimbo Hawkins, the Cabin Boy, alongside 2 copies of the Jim Hawkins Rigging Specialist. And this is going to let you clear locations pretty easily. The Challenger on the 2-cost character stacks. So if you ink more than once, he will have Challenger +4, 6, etc., etc. And when you shift onto that Jim Hawkins, he keeps the Challenger abilities. So you'll be able to clear really big characters or even really big locations if your opponent's not playing around that. Like, I do really want to highlight this Robin Hood, this Sapphire Robin Hood from Chapter 1, 6-cost inkable, 4 strength, 4 willpower, quest for 2, has an ability that says when you play this character, if your opponent has more cards in their hand than you do, you get to draw 1 card. And during your turn, this character has evasive. So not too bad. It's an inkable character. It's only 1 copy. You get to draw a card potentially. Most of the time, you can probably resolve that in a deck where you're playing cards like Fishbone Quill. But what's really important is that this is a very clean out to Genie, right? We're adding cards in the decks that just eliminate Genie. And we're already playing some removal with 3 Fire the Cannons, 3 Grab Your Swords, and 2 Let It Go. But you really want to have as many outs to that card, I think, as possible, right? But Sapphire Steel being really strong this meta because you get to play these mass removal cards like Grab Your Swords, which most decks don't get to play. But we are also playing 2 copies of Lucky Dime alongside Tamatoa and Ariel, so we can burst as much lore as possible. Awesome deck. Love to see it. Congrats to you, Justin Morales, for getting top 16. There was also a revival tournament on the Sunday of the European Championship. So I do believe if you did not win or keep going on to the main event, you got to play a Sunday tournament as well. And first place was Green Purple, piloted by Racklim. This is a deck that he called Glimmer with All My Homies. Love to see it. It looks a lot like the Artifacts deck because we're playing the Clarabelle Shift line, which I personally like. And, you know, we're seeing bonsais, go-go's, bells, the accomplished mystic. There's a reason why the card's been going up in price. But what I really want to talk about is this Prince Philippe right here. He's a 3-cost inkable character, 3 strength, 2 willpower, has ward, and can quest for 2. So nothing too fancy. He's just a strong ward character. It's a character that's probably going to survive on the board most of the times, unless your opponent's playing something like grab your swords, right? But I think what's cool about this is that he has 3 strength, so that means most of the time when you quest with this, if your opponent decides to try and remove it from the board next turn through a challenge, you're more than likely going to clear a character with it. Most characters that are 3 cost or less, even most 4 cost characters, only have 3 willpower. Rabbit, Goat, Crab, Fox, Peter Pan, Kit. All the characters in this deck have around 3 willpower, except for Genie, Belle, and Elsa, and the big Clarabelle, right? And that's like most cards in the meta. So Prince Philip being a very useful card, I think, in this deck. So useful that we have another person playing it in their green-purple list, also in top 8 of the Sunday Revival Tournament. 4 copies of Prince Philip. No Clarabelle shift the line though. Instead, we're playing the 2 copies of Ursula Sea Witch Queen. Maybe that's the character you decide you want to shift into instead of the Clarabelle, because this Ursula can quest for 3, right? I also want to point out they're playing 4 copies of Enchantress, which I haven't really seen in green purple. But green purple, like I said, is kind of an aggro deck, right? So playing Enchantress on turn 2 means you can quest for 2. And look at this: if you challenge Enchantress, she gains 2 strength. What was I just talking about with the Prince Philip? Having 3 strength is really strong. So unless you have cards like Fire the Cannons, Tinkerbell, Brawl for this Enchantress, most of the time the card you swing into it is probably going to also leave the board. That the 3 strength is very strong in Lorcana right now, because most characters can't survive a challenge of 3 strength or more. So that Enchantress might be a card you want to add to your green purple decks. And if you're not playing green-purple, expect to see green-purple, because it also got 3rd place at the Sunday Revival Tournament. Pretty crazy. This one looking very standard, very much like Artibac's list, because this is Artibac. Shout out Artibacs for getting 3rd place at the Sunday Revival Tournament. I know you also made top 32, which is really cool, and you're posting on it. So huge shout out to them in Lorcana deck list for really changing the green-purple meta. There's four green-purple decks were in top 8 of the Sunday Revival Tournament, which was more than 100 players, by the way. It was about like 110 players, but 4 green purple decks in top 8 for that tournament. And look, this one's also playing 3 copies of Prince Philip. That's a card that you definitely might want to consider playing with green purple. And if you're playing against green purple at your locals, you're probably going to start running into Bells and Prince Philips very soon, because it's looking like the goo. Now that I think of it, there's actually a shift Prince Philip that's not bad. So maybe might consider that, playing that. Maybe might consider playing that as well. Also in top 8 of the Revival Tournament, Frank Karsten, a very well-known player, Magic the Gathering Hall of Famer. Just want to give a shout out and recognize this deck. It looks very similar to the deck that he is currently using for the Pixelborn Cross-Continental Tournament, but it's looking like we got a little bit of tweaks in here. Less one-ofs, which I like to see, and some upped copies. So we're playing 3 Lilo, only 1 Lawrence. We are playing 1 I'm Still Here, and 1 World's Greatest Criminal Mind, which is going to eliminate Maui Sharks. I think World's Greatest Criminal Mind is kind of underrated right now. It's a very strong card. This is also a very good out to Pluto. A lot of steel decks are playing Pluto, and World's Greatest Criminal Mind lets you pop the Pluto if it has no damage on it, because that Pluto is going to land on the board with 5 strength. So alongside Pluto, Maui Half Shark, the regular Maui, there's a lot of 5 strength characters that World's Greatest Criminal Mind can really target in the format right now. So huge shout out to Frank Carson for playing Amber Steel with Simba, because we are playing the new Simba Shift character, which is going to let you ready all your exerted characters. I love the synergy with this deck, but we're not seeing the Protective Cub anymore. I missed that. I definitely wanted to see Protective Cub though. While Europe was having its Continentals, North America was having the PAX Unplugged. At that convention, there was a couple Lorcana tournaments. So we have the first place list from the Saturday Constructed tournament. This list looking very much like that first place in Swiss Europe list that we were talking about, using multiple copies of McDuck Manor. We got 2 McDuck Manor in this list, alongside 2 Pirates Life, and only 2 copies of Maui Half Shark. Okay, but as you can see, we're still playing the Sisu Ice Block variants. Have a lot of removal in the early game, and only 1 copy of Lucky Dime. I really like McDuck Manor. Maybe you might want to consider playing McDuck Manor. There is no Flynn Rider or the Sisu Emboldened Warrior here, but that McDuck Manor, it's a card that you might want to consider for you fellow red-blue players. It's really strong. It has 9 willpower and will give you 2 lore at the start of every turn. Most decks cannot out that in one shot. For the most part, Maui Crab seems to be the most effective out for to deal with the McDuck Manor, unless people are playing Cusco's or Rise of the Titans dragons again, but nobody's playing those cards. Nobody's playing the instant location removal in the meta right now, so you can kind of punish your opponent by going Tipo into McDuck Manor if they're playing green or if they're playing Amber Steel. A lot of those characters have really low strength, so there's a world where you play the McDuck Manor on turn 4 and your opponent gets really nervous. They start challenging your McDuck Manor and you can ramp into a Be Prepared to clear their whole board. Or better yet, you can play Sisu, mitigate some damage, and then shift Sisu to clear their whole board. Second place of that PAX tournament was Ruby Amethyst, like I've been saying, one of the best decks, probably the best deck of the format, playing 3 Genie, 3 Rabbit as the split, 4 Be Prepared, and 2 on 1 copy of Big Sisu. A lot of Uninkables in this deck, but I like the 4 Be Prep, 1 Big Sisu, because I don't want to cut like Be Prepared and play 3-1. I kind of want to have 4 Be Prep, but I also still want to play Sisu, the Empowered Sibling. You want to have I like having 5 board wipes. I think it has a lot of potential. But 2 copies of Crab in this list. I feel like I haven't really seen Crab played lately, but Crab does have a lot of utility, especially with the Genie synergy. If you're playing against a mirror match, if you play a Genie and then your opponent plays a Genie and you don't have an out necessarily while they're questing, that Crab can potentially pump up your Genie or your Elsa to clear a very strong evasive character. Next up, we got a first place list from the Azurite Johnny B's 1K tournament. This is a 22-player tournament where first place was Green Yellow, piloted by Nathan Chartrand. Shout out you for getting first place with Amber Emerald. Love to see it, by the way. Probably one of my favorite color combinations of this format because it's an aggro deck that lets you play Rapunzel, lets you play some evasive characters like Dawn Carnage, like we were just talking about, the Shift Pegasus lines, and the new Goofy Expert Shipwright, which is really cool. We're playing 4 copies of Just in Time in this deck. We've talked about a deck like this on the channel before. Just in Time on turn 3 will let you play a 5 cost or lower character from your hand, and we have multiple of those like Pegasus, Nani, Goofy, Dawn Carnage, and Cricky, which are all going to quest for 2 or more, which is really powerful. And there's even scenarios where you might just want to play something like Sven or Rapunzel instead on turn 3 with that Just in Time, in case you can heal a character up, maybe like Ursula, because she does have 3 willpower. But it's a really strong deck. You start off by questing with Daisy Duck, Pegasus, and then you can play some Piglets. And one of the best lines is going Pegasus, Piglet into Shift Pegasus, because then your Piglet has evasive that turn, and there's a really heavy chance your Piglet will survive the next turn so that you can quest for 3 2 times, and 3 times 2 is 6, and that's a lot of lore. You got Jacques as a 3-cost character, which is gonna give an opposing character Reckless, so that helps stop opposing aggro decks, as well as causes them to challenge into your character, which lets you kind of combo that off with the new legendary Tiana. 3-cost uninkable, 1 strength, 4 willpower, quests for 2, and says whenever a character of yours is challenged, the opposing character loses 3 strength unless that player pays 3 ink. So pretty strong card in my opinion if you're playing multiple copies of it, and you can keep playing it back to back because it'll protect your questers, especially the 2 to 3 cost questers. But yeah, green yellow aggro, pretty cool, pretty strong in the meta, so huge shout out to Nathan Chartrand for getting first place at his 1K tournament. Next up, we have a Steel Song deck by Jackson Spears from the Sherwood Championship tournament. This is a 30+ player tournament. This was first place, Amber Steel. This is a little bit more of a traditional list because you're playing more of that curve of Cinderella Ballroom Sensation. Maybe you want to sing some songs like Strength or Storm on the early game. A lot of 1-drops because you're playing 4 Cindy, 4 Daisy, and 3 Nala. We're also playing the heavy questers of Sami, Piglet, and Lawrence. I love Ursula, Vanessa in this deck. I think in Amber Steel it's very strong if you're playing 4 copies of Along Came Zeus, because if your opponent plays a Genie, you just have to have Along Came Zeus, and that Genie is no more. We're playing the Pluto Guard Dog at 3. Like I said, he lands on the board with 5 strength and 5 willpower, and this will let you protect a lot of your early game questers. 4 copies of Gaston, 4 copies of Ariel, because you want to make sure you have a Singer 5 on the board at all times. So when I played Amber Steel, I've come to learn that the more Singers you have, the more better off you are to be able to maintain a control of the board, which is very important, right? Your hardest matchup is always going to be blue-red. Sapphire Ruby feels like an unwinnable matchup in this deck, and we don't see any copies of Lilo for that matchup, but we're seeing just a lot more early game questers, or even just a lot of 1-drops so you can keep questing. You know what I mean? But I do think that cards like Sami, Lawrence, and Pluto are very strong against the red-blue matchup. So Amber Steel is a good deck, regardless of feeling like it has an unwinnable red-blue matchup. We have a lot of cards in this color pattern that let you combat that. So outside of that, you have pretty good matchups across the board. And with Ruby Amethyst just winning this Europe Continental event, there's a world where more people start playing Ruby Amethyst, and a lot of people tend to say that Amber Steel is favored in that matchup. So Amber Steel players, it might be your time. Next up, we got a Blurple deck from top 8 of the Game Castle Austin 1K tournament. Shout out Brian Zarita for getting top 8 with Blurple. Love to see it. Check this out. We don't really see Blurple in the Lorcana metagame, and let alone Blurple with cool cards like Wasabi. 4 cost inkable character, 3 strength, 3 willpower that says whenever you play this character, you may banish chosen item. Its player gains 1 lore. Pretty cool if you need to combat opposing items like Lucky Dime, Popsicle even. It's very strong if you want to stop your opponent from drawing off of their flavor sham maybe. And then we're playing 1 copy of Baymax, the Armored Companion, to complement our Wasabi. You know, you give a little bit of Big Hero 6 lore there. Baymax, 5 cost character, inkable, which is very good. 2 strength, 6 willpower. It lets you heal your characters by up to 2, and for every damage removed, if you gain 1 lore. Not too shabby, but doesn't seem too necessary, so I can see why you're just playing 1, right? Because you are playing Bell the Accomplished Mystic, which is a lot better of a card, I think, for that kind of scenario, because Bell lets you move damage to opposing characters. So it's kind of like dealing damage, but not really, right? I mentioned earlier, this plays around resist, which is very strong in my opinion, because we have been seeing Calhoun's run amok in the metagame. So if there's an opposing Calhoun, you move 2 damage to that Calhoun, and boom, she is gone. Straight to the discard pile. But yeah, Blurple, pretty nice. We got 4 Diablos for a Turtle Box for the early game, Tipo for our ramp alongside Sail the Azurite Sea, but that's it for ramp, nothing else other than that. 2 copies of Hades for our removal, 2 copies of Finders Keepers, which is looking pretty nice, 3 Elsa Spirit of Winter with the 4 Elsa Fit Spirit, because those are the strongest Elsa cards, and 4 copies of Genie with 2 copies of Rabbit, because you need some draw power in every deck. If you're not playing Genie in your purple decks, what are you doing? We have another purple steel list in this top 8. This one looks a little different than the other ones we've been covering. I feel like the other purple steel lists have been taking more of an early game aggro approach, you know, even playing some more passive lore characters like White Rose or heavy questers like Gontu. This one seems just straight up tempo based. We're playing 10 1-drops with Turnabog, Diablo, and Brooms, and then later in turn 2 you have 3 Calhoun or Force Me or Snake to play. You want to play Pete or Crab, followed by a Genie, Goat, or Rabbit, and then Elsa. But your highest cost character in this deck is the Elsa Fit Spirit, because the rest of the cards are 2 Zeus, 4 Strength, 4 Storm, and 4 Library. Wow, we are still seeing locations being played in the meta. I think Library is one of the better locations you can play if you're playing this amount of 1-drops, especially when you're playing Turnabox Followers or Magic Broom, because when you trigger their abilities in the Library, it lets you draw twice. Draw for the Turnabog ability and then draw for the Library. So it kind of feels like you got a little pot of greed there for my fellow Yu-Gi-Oh duelists, if you know what I'm talking about. But, you know, so the Library has a lot of use case in this deck, and I think it's something you should look into if you're playing Purple Steel. This Game Castle 1K consisted of 36 players, and in top 8 we have an Emerald Steel list. Diablo still being pretty powerful. You can shift Diablo on turn 2 so you can draw some cards, but in this list we are not playing Hidden Cope. Instead, we're playing some cards like I Find My Platinum, which is going to let you banish all items. It's a 4-cost inkable song that's in steel that lets you just banish all the items on the board. Maybe they have a lot of items at their meta, so they felt they need to play I Find My Platinum. Shout out Mikey Tell, by the way, for getting top 8 with Emerald Steel. Keeping the Emerald Steel believer's dream alive, right? 2 copies of Twin Fire, uninkable action card that lets you deal 2 damage to a chosen character. Then you can discard a card if you'd like to deal 2 damage to another character. So potentially 4 damage that you can deal spread out amongst 2 different characters, which is kind of nice. We have Muses, Prince John, Ursula, so we have a lot of synergy with our songs like Sudden Chill, which will discard a card. We don't talk about Bruna, which also discards cards, etc., and all these other wonderful songs so you can bounce with Muses. I also want to add that Gogo Tamago is just being played in like every Emerald deck, you know, so if you're playing Emerald and you're not playing a Gogo Tamago, what are you doing? On a Diplomatic Queen is a very strong card, 3 cost, uninkable, 2 strength, 3 willpower that can quest for 2. She has 3 different abilities. She has the ability to banish a damaged character, or make an opponent discard a card, or boost your character's strength by 2. Some people have been playing Honey Lemon instead, because Honey Lemon is inkable and she'll discard as well, but sometimes you really do want that extra ability for on a Diplomatic Queen to banish a character, especially if they're a big character, especially if they're a character that you already generated some lore off of with Gogo Tamago, because you're banishing damaged characters, right? And in first place, we have another Ruby Amethyst list from the Beach Boys Comics 1K. This was a 20-some player tournament, and we have Traris Black, who got first place. Shout out you, Traris. Fellow friend, I like to call him, has a YouTube channel, so go check out their channel. I'll put that in the description below. Playing 3 Rabbit, 3 Genie split, Ruby Amethyst. Pretty classic, you know, build right here. But I do want to mention they're not playing any Tremaine, no big Sisu. because we're playing our location lineup still. 4 copies of Castle, 3 copies of Library. So if you're a Ruby Amethyst enjoyer and you still feel like you want to play locations, hey, you can still see results if you're playing locations. So shout out LSP Terrace. Only 3 copies of Brawl as well for removal. Personally, I think Genie's going to start being played as a 4 of character. You might want to consider playing 4 copies of Brawl, and there's no Mauis in this deck, right? So that's another thing too. If there's not a lot of locations in the meta, Maui becomes kind of subpar, right? For that reason anyway. But there's no Maui in this deck because we have 4 copies of Fox and 2 copies of Crab as well. I also forgot to go over this top 16 Steel Mufasa deck from the Sunday Revival tournament. This deck looks really cool. Kind of reminds me of the Lorganes deck. Shout out Alvin Lorganes, by the way. We got Cindy, Daisies, and Robin Hood Goons in the early game for some pressure, some early questing. But we're also playing these 3 copies of Storm and Strength so that our Cindy has some real pressure, right? So that's the thing about Amber Steel. As you can see in this deck list, we're only playing 6 actions. Everything else is characters because you want to maximize on your ability to, land a character off of Mufasa. But what's crazy about this deck is that when you play the 1-drop Cindy and your opponent's staring down at that, they have to respect it. They have to respect your ability to use Storm Rage on or Strength of a Raging Fire on turn 2. And if you have that card, it sways the game in your favor so much, especially if you're playing a more aggressive strategy like this, where you're having heavy questers like Smee, Lawrence, and Doc. The 3-cost Doc that can quest for 2, and when you quest for 2, you get a second ability. It's like a double whammy. You got the 2 quester and the ability to lower the cost of the next character you play that turn. So you'll be able to play cards like Mufasa, Gantu, and Chenpo on turn 4, which is really nice. You can even play Robin Hood, Champion of Sherwood, on turn 4 if you didn't shift to Robin Hood, right? So this doc lets you play your 5-cost characters early, and I think that's pretty good right now in this meta. Especially if you're playing Robin Hood and Calhoun, all the opposing aggro decks are going to be quivering in their boots because they can't quest, because you're going to gain lore every time they do. Yeah, I definitely think you have to play the Storm and the Strength in this deck, because you just have to have that ability to do it on turn 1s and 2. And if you do succeed in landing some of those cards, your later game turns 3, 4, and 5 just become way smoother. And what's cool about Cinderella, a Ballroom Sensation, is that you can play Cinderella Stout-Hearted as well, Shifter, and Quest for 3, which is very powerful. If you like questing for 3, you'll definitely like questing for 4 if you see a Gantu off of that Mufasa, right? Because Gantu's going to be able to quest for 4 and possibly get you to 20 faster than any other deck. And if you're struggling to get to 20, maybe you're at 16, 18 lore, you have 4 copies of Baloo, which is really strong. Baloo lets you burst lore. I think most Amber decks should be playing Baloo right now, especially with how popular like red purple is and red blue is. Baloo is a bodyguard character, 3 cost, uninkable, 0 strength, 3 willpower that says when this character is banished, gain 2 lore. You get to a point in this deck where you're at 14, 16 lore, and if you just draw Baloo after Baloo, it doesn't matter what your opponent does, because they lose the moment this Baloo gets banished, and you can even banish your own Baloo with your own Strength of a Raging Fire. But that's going to be it for this video, my Lorcana Goons. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content, and if you want to send me your deck lists, join our Discord. We have a deck list section there. If you guys ever do well at any tournaments or have top 8s from any tournament, send them to our Discord. Really appreciate it. Huge shout out again to the Mingo Martinez for getting first place, our first European Challenge Championship. Now, I want to ask you guys, do you think Ruby Amethyst is the best deck? What do you think is the best deck after seeing all of these wonderful deck lists from these top players at these tournaments? Next up, we have North American Continentals coming in January, so can't wait to see who wins that and what deck is piloted. But until then, be sure to stay tuned to Lorcana Goons, and we'll see you Goons next time.